Hey, it's Broken Office Chair, a podcast produced by Alternatives. Broken Office Chair is hosted by Alternatives Executive Director Bessie Alcantara. Bessie is a Chicago native, first-generation Salvadoran Mexican-American who's passionate about dismantling systemic racism. In each episode, Bessie will be joined by her friends and colleagues who are ready to speak candidly about their experiences as people of color in their various professions. In the episodes, they'll address topics such as issues in the nonprofit sector, racial equity, DEI in practice, and much, much more.
Today, I am joined by Andrea Ortez, a program officer at Woods Fund Chicago. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Why don't we jump off by you telling me a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I currently work as a program officer with Woods Fund Chicago. I joined a little bit over a year ago. Prior to that, I was a community organizer throughout Chicago. I actually moved to Chicago in 2007 to go to Loyola University of Chicago. So, but grew up in Los Angeles. I'm the daughter of a Mexican mother and Salvadorian father.
Really?
So I believe there's something to talk about there as Salvi Mexicans. And I'm very much the product of growing up in Los Angeles with two immigrant parents. Grew up in a first and second generation Latino community. My father came as a refugee during the Civil War in El Salvador, and then my mom is one of 11 kids, and she came to the U.S. kind of wanting to spread her own wings and find herself. But they met doing work at sanctuary churches in Los Angeles, serving undocumented individuals that had just crossed the border. So grew up in a very social justice oriented family. Our religious community was really focused on liberation theology and just the pillars of caring for the poor. So it made sense that when I moved to Chicago, I kind of went through that typical young adult existential crisis of who am I? What am I going to do in this world? And I was eventually invited to a block party on the southwest side of the city. And that's how I met community organizers in Chicago, started working. I worked for almost 10 years with the Southwest Organizing Project. And then I did some organizing work in the south suburbs of Chicago. And then eventually came back into the city once I started my young family, recognizing that traveling was just going to be a little tougher. So started with Woods, like I mentioned, a little over a year ago. And it's been both fascinating and unfamiliar to step into the philanthropic space, having come from the organizing world. But I can't imagine doing it anywhere else, just considering how Woods approaches philanthropy and what we're prioritizing with our dollars, which is community organizing and advocacy work. So
there is so much I want to jump into because I don't often meet another Salvadoran. And so if you are, so your dad was the one who immigrated from El Salvador.
Yeah.
Something came up recently. I was talking to somebody about the refugee experience in our parents. Have you seen any of it with your dad and how it shows up, the trauma of living through a civil war?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, so I'll share, my dad is the eldest son in his family. He has an older sister and then two younger brothers. And my grandparents in general were pretty adamant as things got worse in the 70s and 80s to create opportunities for their children to get out. And they were especially concerned for my dad, who was male, and there was that vulnerability of being either pulled into the military, basically. And so he was an exchange student with a family in Kentucky, out of all places. Yeah. Rural Kentucky. And he stayed with them for some months, and that family actually eventually helped my other uncles during an even more difficult time during the war come to the United States and be in the United States. Eventually, my dad and his older sister moved to Los Angeles to pursue their careers. And my dad was always very honest with the history and the policies that led to these realities in his own personal life. So we grew up in a household that dove into history, and assessed even the United States involvement in different countries to make sense as to why, right? The people don't want to leave their homeland. They don't want to be in these uncomfortable situations or leave what they understand as true. And I think because of that context, that also meant, and because of the work that my parents did in their community, we were exposed to a lot of people that had similar stories to our parents, but without the privileges that my parents had.
Yeah.
So when it comes to traumas and realities like that, like I have vivid memories of like friends of my parents coming and like me asking them like, why do you have that big scar on your arm? And him saying like, oh, I was imprisoned and I was tortured with acid during the war. And this is, so like hearing those and then connecting the dots to like realities that my dad lived as a young child and witnessing adults who stood up against power structures, trying to protect children, and it being a core memory for him. Like, that is, and seeing not only those pains, but how for him, so much of the healing was also the accountability and the expectation of we are created for others. We have to be in service to our community. And so I think for my dad, a lot of his frustration came from not being the one that decided that he had to leave El Salvador. But then in the 90s, he made the decision that we were all going to move out there. So me and my siblings, my mom, we all moved to El Salvador with the really chasing my dad's hope and dream of going back to a place that was home for him. And I think that period in his life really solidified that El Salvador wasn't going to offer the quality of life that he even hoped for his children. And I think it helped him also make sense as to why my grandfather had made the decisions he made for him. And it's because you realize that wars or history books can tell you a war was from X date to X date, and you assume that like, okay, and then the next day everything's back to business as usual. But to this day, El Salvador is still grappling with a lot of the instability that took place back then. And so in the 90s, my parents were like, no, this isn't like, it would have been nice to bring them back to their father's homeland. It would have been nice for them to have that experience. But I think shortly after making that decision, they realized like, this isn't going to be this isn't the life that we want for them. And if we want them to be individuals that can serve others, they have to be given access to much more than what's possible here. So I feel like I kind of answered your question and offered some context, but I think for my dad, there's always been big feelings in his life, big feelings that I think at times he's felt like have to be suppressed or have to be pushed to the side. And you learn when you've had such significant vulnerabilities, you become very protective of the most vulnerable parts of your story, right?
Yeah.
And so I have a lot of memories of my dad speaking publicly and encouraging people to like build solidarity with others. But when it came to those one-on-one experiences or even being able to have those moments with him individually, I think it was much harder.
My mom has never talked about it. So my mom, and so it's funny because we have very different experiences. My mom is, her mom passed away when she was about 15. Okay. So it's her and my aunt, and that's it. And their dad was not in the picture. And so they didn't have a lot of, I think, just even support growing up. And when they immigrated, my mom was, I think, about 20 years old. And my aunt had came here before. And it took me a long time to just kind of piece the entire story together. A lot of it just simply because my mom didn't talk about it. What little I know about the war from their experience comes from my aunt, who openly talked about it. She talks about witnessing a situation where there was a party and the military came and executed every man in the household during the party. And things like that, or using children to transport messages or having curfews. And my mom actually took me to El Salvador during the war. And so I remember the tanks and what I thought were fireworks in the sky still. And I think it was still wanting to have, keep some sort of connection And similarly, when I was in high school, which would have been the 90s, she said she wanted to move back. And we had a fit about it, and we're like, absolutely not. But interestingly enough, she actually has a house there today because that's her retirement plan, is to go back.
Nice.
So she never let go of wanting to go back.
Yeah. My dad, to this day, will still throw out that comment on occasion. And I think it holds true for him. Like, he's retired now. He worked for the state of California for many, many years. And so he has a pension. So we're all kind of like, yeah, if he wants to, he could totally go back and live a comfortable life. But yeah, I think for him, similarly, it seems like that longing and that comfort of being back home is something that they desire. I have so many questions for you, and I know this isn't even the
that's
main.
Not supposed to be the topic, but I think it's interesting. No, and for me, like, it's been over 40 years, right? Yeah. And for the desire to want to go back, I think there's a lot of interesting conversation about what's happening in El Salvador in general right now under the current president. I think it's also an interesting conversation as the asylum seekers continue to come up in Chicago. And I've talked about it on this podcast a little bit in terms of like the language that we're using in terms, not asylum seekers, but the migrant crisis, right? And this narrative around folks coming here and taking up all of our resources and things like that. And it always frustrates me because it's, to your point, people don't want to leave home and come here. There's a desperation that I think that we cannot imagine if we were born and raised here that exist in countries, especially that have some sort of political instability going on. Yeah. So that's why I wanted to pursue the route too. And I wanted to address something else that you said, which is how U.S. policy impacted El Salvador. I don't know if you feel comfortable enough saying more about that. Like, I feel like it's a topic I don't know enough about personally.
Yeah. I don't know a lot, but I think just even the degree to which there are and I'm sure we're going to dive into this, even with the intended topic that we're going to discuss. But there are power structures in this world, and they exist with a level of stability so that they can replicate things that work across various regions. And I think when you look at some of the most powerful countries in the world, like there are alliances with each other to ensure that there is no one rustling any feathers or messing up their agenda, right? And so there are ways in which these countries have historically worked together to dismantle any uprisings, any instability in other countries to ensure that they continue to sustain that power, that they continue to have that power. So making the connections to what's going on in Venezuela or what's going on in Palestine or what's going on, or what happened throughout Central America in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, or what happened in Africa decades before that, you know? So I think it's not a history that is unique to El Salvador.
Right.
But from practices like who trained their military was externally manipulated by larger powers outside of El Salvador. So you can't say it was exclusively a civil war, because they were, for lack of a better term, like puppeteers with their hands in El Salvador for a variety of reasons, right? And it's it goes back to those notions, and we grapple with this a lot in our work, especially being in a position where we are of power, where we are able to give dollars to a lot of these efforts, is like the intentional structuring of scarcity throughout communities is not only happening in a global sense and outside of the United States, but also very much within the United States. We don't talk about the histories of people that come to this country prior to them crossing the border. Right. We only acknowledge when they crossed the border and they became an inconvenience to our society, right? Like a burden for us to carry. And it's like, no, like these were full lives. I mean, in some of my work, knowing women that are ama de casas, or like
housewives.
Yeah. But in their countries, they were lawyers, they were doctors, they were, but that story is lost. The minute they cross the border, they've been stripped of all of those credentials. They've been, and so going back to your question around like policies and histories, it's colonialism, it's imperialism, and those structures have historically been the ones that have been that have led to instabilities in countries and led to the migration of people to stability. And where are they going to find stability? In countries that are more powerful, that do have resources, that have means by which that they can obtain a level of dignity. And so for my parents, both of them benefited from the amnesty in 1986. So I didn't grow up with parents that were undocumented, but I grew up in a neighborhood where that wasn't the reality. So again, I think my parents were also very adamant about like, know your history, know where you are located in this, and know that your privileges are not for you to just ride a wave and keep going. Your privileges are for you to be in service to others. And so I think just even my individual learning around the history of immigration within the United States comes from acknowledging that my parents' own history and the stressors that I could have lived with on a day-to-day basis. By kindergarten, my parents were both citizens. So I didn't have that fear of, will mom and dad be home today after school, But I had a lot of classmates who feared in those ways, right? And so I think I'm very grateful for the historical like lens that I was given growing up, but then also the expectation and the accountability I was given moving from that history, right? How do you bring that to present day to make sure that everybody's treated with dignity ultimately?
I think, so funny enough, my parents also went under the 1986 amnesty, but I think they were undocumented a little longer.
Okay.
Because they had me in Spanish-speaking bilingual classes just in case they were deported.
Huh.
And so I've learned since then that there was a plan, like who would pick up the kids if somebody was deported, etc.
Yeah.
But I think there's something interesting too about the Latino experience that a lot of people don't really think about, because like you said, we pick up history the moment we enter the country, but it's like there's a displacement narrative, but there's also a colonization narrative, within our countries, right? And it was just maybe like in the last 8 years that I really started digging into El Salvador, because one of the things I noticed with El Salvador was that it had a lower percentage of Black folks than other countries surrounding it. And what I learned was that El Salvador quickly was so racist, they quickly picked up policies to not allow Black people into the country. And so we have a teeny bit of enslavement in our history, but not as much, because they thought that it was better to not have Black people in the country, period, for fear of mixing. Huh. And so I've gone like country by country learning about how each place approached colonization, how they approached enslavement, how they went through the process of intentionally erasing indigenous identity and all these different things. So there's that story. There is the instability during the 70s, 80s that you mentioned. And then there's the displacement narrative of having to leave your home country and enter the US. And so just the long history of trauma that is very much intertwined with the US that people just miss when we're having the present day conversation. That is very fascinating to me.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And then also, I think, it's a whole continent. So not every country, like each narrative is also going to be very different. And then that doesn't even take so that's like political trauma, right? And historical trauma in that sense. And then there's personal trauma, just realities, the mere struggle of crossing a desert. Or who do I trust along this route to get me from point A to point B? or even the vulnerabilities that women have faced. I mean, I have friends that work at clinics here in Chicago and have needed to respond to also an increase in just vulnerability from women within the asylum seekers, and just women that got pregnant along the way, not by choice, but because that they were in situations less than ideal, right? We won't dive into that per se, but I think for me, it's not only like the historical piece and the political piece, but then add on top of that, just like the vulnerabilities that I will face just by being a woman in this world, and the layered traumas there, right? And so, yeah, I think I think we're at a really interesting point, because you also look at communities like the asylum seekers now, the majority of them being from further south, right?
Yeah.
In South America, and having a larger Black population, right? These are Afro-Latinos. Like, and I have a 4-year-old who right now is learning that people don't have homes to live in, that there are some people that don't have a place to live, and that there are people that ask for help on street corners, right? And he'll be asking, like, what does their sign say? And what does their sign say? Or, Mama, how do you know that they speak Spanish? And I'm just like, I don't know. I mean, it's initial, I guess in some ways it's an assumption, but then there's that explanation to him. It's like, oh, because you think they look like you. And I was like, but they don't really look like so it's been interesting to even explore all of that with his inquiry of just pure curiosity, right? But I think Chicago's in an interesting place where we are, this is an opportunity for us to look at this differently and to ask ourselves, are we going to approach this like we've done it every other single time, where we have forced these communities to merely fend for themselves and decide whether the strain that they are dealing with on a day-to-day basis is worth it, right? Or are we going to operate like what we have said we are, which is a sanctuary city, right? And actually facilitate the structures that would allow them to have a dignified life, right? But I don't feel like I see that to the scale that I think is possible, right? And I know there's a lot of debate in terms of how that could be done, or what are the approaches that could take place. But even with a population like from Venezuela, these are also individuals that come from a government that meets the needs of their people differently. And so just even how you hear Venezolanos speak within the United States with this expectation of the government should be caring, the government should be more involved, but the social service structure doesn't exist here the ways they do in other countries. And so it's very interesting to me to also imagine like the expectations and that differentiation. And then Americans then take those statements and see them as, well, who do they think they are to feel so like entitled to this, right? But they come from countries that operate differently, right? That do have these social services in place, so that there isn't that degree of scarcity. So I think there's a lot of layers to all of it.
That is another really interesting conversation to me, because for one, I fully believe that the government should be taking care of the basic needs of every citizen and individual that lives in this country, right?
Agreed.
So that should be the expectation, but we have somehow, as a country, decided that that's not the thing that we're going to demand from our government. Instead, let every individual fend for their own. It also brings up for me a lot of what we saw with the last Trump election, with Latinos in specific areas voting for Trump because they're scared of what they think that is the democratic socialism that is rooted in the trauma of some of the countries that were adopting more socialist policies. And as a result, it led to their displacement.
Yeah.
And so just the amount of like misinformation that also goes on within our communities is wild to me. And not registering that like the lack of education is intentional so that we can continue to vote against our own interests.
Yeah.
And so that's the other piece that's frustrating to me, because even with right now with the asylum seekers, the fact that a lot of them are Afro-Latinos. I think it's being erased from the narrative that these are Black individuals. And then the other piece that's also really frustrating is that there's a conversation right now that we can't show up for the asylum seekers because we need to show up for our own communities first, and that asylum seekers are taking the resources of what have been historically under-resourced communities in Chicago. So going back to that idea of scarcity of resources, I like to call it the myth of scarcity, because I want us to reframe the conversation. And so it's really frustrating to me to see that, because if we are showing up with resources for the asylum seekers, that means those resources have been here. And we just, as a city or state or whatever it may be, decided that we didn't want to show up with them for communities that existed. And also, if anything, if the current instability or the current genocide that's happening in Israel has taught us, is that we can come up billions of dollars when we want to, right? Yeah. So it's a very frustrating conversation for me, but I think it starts to transition into what you do for a living now. Yeah. Which is fund advocacy work. Yeah. So talk to me why that's important to you.
Yeah. And I'll make the connection this way as well. I think for us, we also, I appreciate your shift in language and acknowledgement that that myth of scarcity, although it is a lived reality for many people, right? But our work is within a grant-making philanthropic structure, but really Woods Fund Chicago has been working really adamantly in the last few years to shift and to ensure that we stay relevant to the needs of who we fund and accountable to the ways in which we need to advocate for their funding. So we do find ourselves as funders within a very small focus because we're funding community organizing and advocacy work, which doesn't get the majority of the funding within the philanthropic space. We aim and have really adopted this trust-based philanthropy model and try to align all of our practices with that framework in ensuring that we are working towards shifting the power and historical lack of accountability in the philanthropic space and giving that power back to community and back to the organizations that are doing work on the ground. And so I'll briefly share how when, of course, there have been conversations in the philanthropic space around asylum seekers and to what degree are we going to support this vulnerable community that is within our city and across many cities within the United States. And there's been a lot of tension, a lot of turmoil. And this is before, the comparison is before my time at Woods. But many of my colleagues who have been in philanthropy for at least the last 5 years got to bear witness during the pandemic, philanthropy come together, kind of work through all the red tape and say, we're dismissing all of that and we're just going to stay united in supporting our country, our city, our neighborhood in getting through this crisis, right? This pandemic. And many of my colleagues speak to like just the camaraderie and the way in which that was able to happen so seamlessly, and the hope that they had that post-pandemic they would be able to see the same efforts with other issues that would come up, right? And so now fast forward to the needs around asylum seekers, and the practice has reverted back to how philanthropy approached things before the pandemic, right? That as if that was a one-time experience, and let's just stay with what we're comfortable with, which is a lot of jumping through hoops and convincing people and negotiating to pull funds together to support people. And I think for Woods, we are smaller in size in terms of how much we're able to give. Our endowment is not as large as some of the larger foundations. But we try to be really intentional about how we give those dollars. All our dollars are general operating funds. So it allows, within our core grants, their general operating dollars. So it gives grantee partners the flexibility to use those dollars however they need. And then in addition, this year we've rolled out with a multi-year process. So providing our grantee partners the reassurance that or the confidence that they can rely on these funds for multiple years. And then, of course, our application and our means by which we work and check in and build relationships with our grantees is relational. We don't have an application that is a heavy lift. We also don't look to those application processes as, again, a jumping through hoops. Instead, we recognize that we want to facilitate, and the best way that we can advocate for our grantee partners is giving them the space to do their work. And so our ask for the application is relatively light, but then even the checkpoints, once you are a grantee partner of ours, stay within the parameters of we have conversations or site visits that that are a series of questions that allow us to get a sense of where the work is at and how we best can support them. But we're not asking them to write extensive budgets or reports to justify their dollars. And so bringing it back to what we were just talking about, we also have rapid response dollars that we're able to grant to our core grantees that allow like the title suggests, when there is an issue or a campaign that requires a rapid response, we're able to facilitate these grants and give them access to it. And when we saw the limitations within the philanthropic space around supporting asylum seekers, but also recognize simultaneously that our city lacks the social service infrastructure to support a population like this in the ways that we needed, we then chose to send a rapid response application out, targeting our grantee partners that were either supporting asylum seekers or supporting the unhoused. And we recognize that both were one and the same, right? That if we're looking for housing for asylum seekers, but we still have a significant unhoused population throughout the city, then both need to get the support, and it needs to become a seamless process. And so I think our work, we try to think more big picture and look at kind of sustain that bird's eye view with our work, so that when there is that tension between communities that is beginning to brew, we're trying to stay ahead of it and say, no, the need is across the board. So we're going to address that need across the board to the best of our abilities, even with our own limitations, as opposed to have you all come fighting for the same. Right. And we believe that stays true to our approach of being or providing dollars in a way that that is rooted in trust and in giving power back to community ultimately.
And I mean, this is a city that I think historically has had a lot of Black and brown tension in general. And the way that the dollars are being set up right now, and that's always what's frustrating to me. I'm like, if we can come together, this benefits everybody, because it is similar issues across the board, right? But that is not how funding normally rolls out. I do think it's interesting that you have a specific focus on advocacy, which is different from other foundations that may say you can't even do lobbying or advocacy of any sort, right? And so can you talk a little bit about why advocacy is the thing that's really important to y'all?
Yeah. I think both advocacy and community organizing is important because we want to put dollars into individuals that are looking to change the structures within society that do not serve our communities. And so we're looking for organizations that have a base of leaders that are impacted by the issues on the ground. We're looking to have organizations that are grappling with power structures within their scope of their work and identifying ways in which they can give power back to community members and to again, people on the ground. And so for us, our work is really motivated by, like, we recognize within our philanthropic space that we are looking to have people our colleagues think about power differently. But that's because the funding that we offer is for folks that are already doing that on the ground. And so when we think about even the advocacy that we do within our organization, it is both advocating for our grantee partners so that they can continue to do the work that they do, and then simultaneously advocate within the philanthropic space so the philanthropic space can think differently about the work that they do. And so advocacy and organizing work is at the core of Woods, in the sense that we want to change dominant culture, and we want organizations that are imagining a different world to have access to dollars. And that leads us to also prioritize organizations that are much smaller, that are younger in their existence, because we recognize that they are the ones coming in with that innovative and thoughtful approach on how we can change structures within our world. And so it really comes down to, we want to see those power shifts. We want to see power being given back to community.
So we are almost at time.
Wow, that was fast.
And so what would you say to folks that we should be working on to create change?
That's a loaded question. I think we need to ask ourselves why we do what we do on a day-to-day basis. And what I mean by that is the tasks are there. Tasks will always be there in our work. But is it rooted in a deeper why? And is it rooted and associated with a vision of what this world could be? And this is where I come back to like my organizing roots and notions of like the world as it is versus the world as it should be. I was trained as a young adult to understand that like my role as a leader, if I'm going to play a leadership role in my community, is to understand the way the world is, but to constantly aspire towards the world as it should be. And I think that aligns with a lot of my upbringing. I think that aligns a lot with how I'm raising even my own children. And I don't think people explore that enough on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
And grapple with, how are the tasks that I am doing today creating the world as it should be? And what are the aspects of that world that maybe I'm uncomfortable with, or maybe I don't fully understand because I don't have an understanding of that community's needs, or I don't. So I think with that, there also comes a curiosity. You have access into asking questions around the world that people want for themselves, right? And what in this world makes them angry or they are unsettled with. So I think the sentiment that I'm trying to get to is there's a lot of power in being able to be more reflective on your day-to-day practice and really ask yourself what type of impact you would like to leave, and what are the structures that are preventing that. And is there a way to challenge that? Not in a way where you're like flipping tables over. I recognize we're not in all positions to do that, but in ways that allow for other people to think differently with you, right? You'd be surprised when you engage in a conversation how many more people actually want more of that world that you're imagining than you think, but they feel very stuck in just the way the world currently operates. And so encouraging folks to put themselves in that leadership position and strive for the world that we all deserve.
Well, thank you so much for being here. But where can folks find you online?
I'm not I'm a millennial, but I'm not a social media type of person in that sense. But I can share my email, but andrea@woodsfund.org is the best way to get a hold of me.
All right. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Keep up with everything going on at Alternatives, or to donate, you can visit us at our website, alternativesyouth.org. You can also follow us at Alternatives Inc. on Instagram or at Alternatives Youth on Facebook. If you want to keep up with Bessie, you can follow her on Instagram and TikTok at Bessie_Alcantara. Thanks for listening.